Welcome back to Silicon Wafers, and this is a continuation of the episode that started on the main Silicon Curtain channel this evening. So check that one out before watching this, and then maybe watch them back to back, and you'll get the full picture. Or, of course, you could save them for the Christmas break. This is a slightly different format. We're going to be looking at why Trump's behavior indicates that security guarantees to Ukraine are not worth the paper they are written on. Before we jump in, thank you to everyone who supports the channel. Do please make sure you are subscribed because we have a very low subscriber to viewer ratio. And YouTube seems to have been unsubscribing people against their will, or at least that is the suggestion that some people have made. So please do check you're subscribed so you don't miss any episodes. And in this episode, we continue the theme that Trump shits on everything and everyone when they cease to be useful to him. We will go back to his first chaotic administration. That's what we did in the first episode, to understand the patterns and see what he's learned in his second, to try to avoid airing his dirty laundry in public, and of course getting away from the revolving door of sacked and disgraced aides, supporters, minions, sycophants, etc. We'll also ask, what are the implications for Ukraine and the Trump security guarantees, the so-called security guarantees as part of the peace process, as well as the implication for Venezuela and the incipient war, based on a repeated pattern of behaviour in Trump that seeks to avoid all accountability, responsibility, or blowback for his mistakes, actions, and inactions, and his clear corruption that is happening in plain sight. And of course, we have the most recent example of this in the despicable language he used in response to the brutal and tragic murder of Rob Reiner and his wife. Trump debases everything, every conversation. Every act becomes political, and everything that is political becomes personal. Trump is depraved. He is a moral vacuum, a communications super sewer, bringing filth and hate to his audience as well as to his adversaries. Allies become enemies in a heartbeat and are instantly abandoned. Then he treats them with the disdain, the same disdain with which he treats all his adversaries. In fact, anyone that does not show complete subservience to him or acquiesce to play the humiliation game in the court of King Trump. Or what are the domestic, political, and geopolitical implications of this abuse, this inconsistency, this need for control, the need to subvert and humiliate everyone around him? Well, we're going to start, before we get on to Ukraine, we're going to start with DOGE, chaos disguised as efficiency, soft power being the collateral damage. DOGE, or the Department of Government Efficiency, arrived with a great deal of hype. Elon Musk's X megaphone and a promise to streamline the governance of the US, of the states. And then came the cuts, the disruption, and the human wreckage. Reuters investigated the early months and found 20 instances across 14 agencies where staff and funding cuts produced bottlenecks, higher costs, paralysis, longer wait times, talent flight. In fact, the opposite of efficiency. One quote from the Reuters reporting captures the whole thing. Jessica Riedel of the Manhattan Institute, who is absolutely no far-left critic, she said DOGE is not a serious exercise. That's reported in Reuters, April 24th, 2025. But it was an exercise of something, though, political vandalism on an unprecedented scale. Then in November, Reuters reported DOGE had effectively been disbanded early, despite months left on its charter of activities. DOGE wasn't a savings program. Let's be clear, it was a political weapon, a way to break parts of the state that don't flatter the leader, that don't serve his ends, that don't obey fast enough, or don't serve the Trump brand. And it's a way to generate reams of headlines and news coverage, all the while humiliating opponents and showing up their total impotence in the face of Trump's irrational political power. But this has all been leading to something bigger. the exercise of political power to cover up domestic political issues and misdemeanors. Now we hit the most dangerous convergence of this behavior and these trends, that is foreign escalation and domestic scandal. If Putin invaded Ukraine to try to shore up his own regime, then what if Trump invades Venezuela to consolidate his own tenuous grip on power? So, Venezuela, escalation, Monroe Doctrine politics, and the temptation of diversion. The Reuters framing is clear. Lawmakers say Trump's objectives remain unclear, even after months of escalation, of boat strikes, forced build-ups, and now major new pressures. An embargo of Venezuelan oil and shipping. Reuters reports that Rubio and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth held closed classified briefings for Congress amid mounting speculation about a strike on Venezuelan territory. Again, that's in Reuters. Reuters also reported Trump's Venezuela posture, that it sits inside a revived Monroe Doctrine worldview. That is, the Western Hemisphere as a US zone of influence, explicitly linked to denying China access to resources and strategic footholds. What the policy implies is that America is shrinking away from its role as the world's policeman to become a small-time bully in its own backyard. Well, that's one way to take out the frustration of a rapid imperial decline. We should also listen to the experts that Reuters quotes. Venezuelan scholar David Smild says that China-Russia alignment is a central irritant in Trump's worldview. The idea that you have this country in our hemisphere and its main allies being China and Russia, that's something that doesn't really fit into Trump's view of the world. That's reported in Reuters, December 16th, 2025. But let's dig beneath that. What if there's a deal that does align with Trump's worldview? Here, Russia, you take Ukraine and Europe, and I can have all of this stuff in my own backyard. Domestically, the backlash is sharpening around these war powers that Trump seems to be gathering to himself. A bipartisan group introduced a war powers resolution to block unauthorized hostilities. And Republican Joaquim Castro posted a blunt warning: a naval blockade is unquestionably an act of war. He posted that on X, formerly Twitter. Internationally, China and Russia are already positioning. Reuters reports China opposed what it called unilateral bullying while offering no concrete aid packages. Is this out of strategic caution, or does it hint at a tactical agreement to divide the world up into spheres of influence and only lightly meddle in the perceived sphere of another imperial power? Again, of course, that is speculation, but it's something to watch and think about. Reuters reports Russia warned Trump not to make a fatal mistake. I'm sure Russia does not want to lose another ally after Syria, but then Ukraine is also a far greater priority for Putin than Venezuela. Now the most sensitive part, motive. We need to pose a blunt question. Does Trump plan on going to war to protect his own power, to punish critics and cover scandals? Is he capable of that? Well, I think this may depend. It may depend on what happens next. He's putting the pieces in place in case they are required. And all of this depends, I think, on how bad the Epstein scandal is going to hit and how much reputational damage it does and how much pushback he gets within the GOP, which up until now has been more of a rubber stamp organization for him. What we can say factually, however, is this: Trump is under sustained political pressure over the Epstein files saga. Reuters reports Americans are deeply skeptical. Only 23% approve of his handling of it, 52% disapprove, and a majority believe the government is hiding information about Epstein's death and trafficking network. That's according to Reuters. Reuters also reports Democrats released new Epstein estate images that includes Trump and quotes Trump is trying to minimize it. Everyone knew this man. There are hundreds and hundreds of people that have photos with him. That of course, is true. But it's a curious irony that Trump seems to appear in those photos more than anybody else. Reuters reports the Justice Department was compelled by law to release the Epstein files within 30 days, placing a hard calendar deadline on a scandal with high public distrust, but very high interest as well. Well, here is a factual framing of that, and of course, I'll let you draw your own conclusions. Venezuela is already being used as a stage for dominance politics, that is, the Monroe Doctrine messaging, strength and spectacle. That's in Reuters. Domestic pressure is real and quantifiable. Polling, document deadlines, internal White House tensions. The pressure is building on Trump. Escalation, of course, carries structural incentives. Foreign crises can reorder media attention. It can discipline some internal dissent sometimes, and it can recast the president as a commander-in-chief, making them a little more immune from criticism. That does not prove, however, a diversion war is being planned, but it makes the risk profile pretty ugly and very scary, because the same leadership style that we've been describing in these two episodes, discarding allies, attacking institutions, governing through humiliation, pairs catastrophically with decisions that can kill large numbers of people and ignite a regional conflict when those same tendencies are applied on a geopolitical scale. And this is where Ukraine and Russia come roaring back into the frame, because every time democratic governance is turned into a grievance performance by Trump, every time institutions are treated as enemies, the media demonized, and America behaves in an ever more capricious and imperial fashion. Russia's strategic argument gets stronger. Look, they'll say, this is what we told you America always was. They may have played a role in transforming the US into the worst version of itself, but this is also a story that the Russians can spin endlessly for advantage in the so-called global south and on the African continent. And domestically, they can say democracy is chaos. Open societies can't govern themselves. The West has no values. Do you want that? Do you want to follow down that route? Of course, it's a mixture of outright lies and distorted truths, but it will nonetheless prove effective for some. So will Trump honour Ukraine's post-ceasefire security guarantees? If Trump's governing style is transactional and with temporary loyalty, using people, institutions, alliances, then discarding them the second they're inconvenient, then here's the question that matters in Kyiv, Warsaw, Tallinn, and frankly Taipei as well. If there's a ceasefire in Ukraine and then Russia attacks again, what are the chances Trump follows through on whatever security guarantees the US signs up to? Let's ground this in what's on the table right now, because there is a live debate this week about what guarantees even mean. Point one, what the guarantees are being described as. Here is a brief description. What we know so far in the Berlin talks, US officials and European leaders have been floating Article 5-like language, NATO-ish in vibe, even if Ukraine is not in NATO. Reuters reported on December 15th, 2025, that the US proposal includes NATO-style guarantees similar to Article 5, and the UK government's joint statement, December 15th, signed by a heavy stack of European leaders, spells out the architecture they say should back any deal. That includes a Ukrainian armed force kept at 800,000 in its peacetime state, a European-led multinational force operating inside Ukraine, supported by the US, a US-led ceasefire monitoring and verification mechanism. And this is the key line, a legally binding commitment subject to national procedures to take measures to restore peace and security after a future armed attack, including armed force and intelligence, logistics, and economic diplomatic actions. That's from a UK government release. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, speaking to ZDF, reported by Reuters on December 16th, 2025, pushed the point even further, saying that under these post-ceasefire guarantees, peacekeepers could, in some circumstances, repel Russian forces if Russia violates the terms, and he called the American position remarkable. I rather think, actually, it'll be remarkable if those forces fight back and engage the Russians, but that's just my cynical point of view here. Meanwhile, the AP reports that US officials saying the plan needs US Senate approval and warning it won't remain available indefinitely. Again, this is the odd line about this peace treaty being a bit like a carton of milk going off, and that certainly doesn't suggest any kind of durability and stability behind a process. And we must also say that this might all look good on paper, but a piece of paper was used to betray Czechoslovakia in 1938 too. Well, second section, guarantees that aren't enforceable are just theatre. Ukraine has seen this show before. Ukraine has an institutional memory of security assurances that failed. The Budapest Memorandum problem, lofty words, weak mechanisms, catastrophic results. Belfer Center analysis has long described the Budapest Memorandum as not a ratified, legally binding treaty, but rather political commitments, precisely the kind of paper shield that collapses when the aggressor decides to test it. That history is why the current European statement tries to sound harder, legally binding commitment, and why Kiev keeps asking bluntly who will do what, on which day, with what forces and what equipment if Russia strikes again. So, what are the odds that Trump follows through? Here's the cleanest way to say it. Trump is least likely to honour a guarantee that requires sacrifice, time, and discipline and resources, and most likely to honour a guarantee that could be framed as leverage, punishment, or a deal. But again, the devil is going to be in the detail. And in this respect, we must look to another Trump deal that just proves not to be worth the paper it's written on, signed in good faith by the UK and reneged on without a backward glance by Trump. Trump has just suspended the £31 billion tech trade deal with Britain, brokered during his state visit to Britain this year, in a blow to Sir Keir Starmer's hopes of forging closer ties with the US. Well, so much for allies, so much for promises, so much for guarantees. Even this year, Reuters quoted Trump's basic line on European security. Europe should be a first line of defense and the US will help them out. But how exactly? And when push comes to shove, will they help out? Carnegie's March 2025 roundup of expert views captures the recurring theme, Trump signaling that Europe should carry the burden and that strong US backing for European guarantees is not something to assume. Again, this does not sound at all certain. If the guarantee is effectively America will fight Russia for Ukraine, a true Article 5 analogue, then the odds look low, vanishingly low, a snowball in hell's chance, because it clashes with his repeatedly stated preference to avoid long-term liabilities and shift responsibility entirely to Europe. Again, that is the Carnegie Endowment. But if the guarantee is designed as a snap-back system, that is automatic sanctions, automatic weapons pipelines, automatic financing, with the Europeans paying for it all, then perhaps it becomes a little more plausible because it fits a style of coercion that Trump can sell domestically as strength without committing US troops and claiming that he's not paying for any of it. Others can read this as a kind of cop-out, a way of keeping the cavalry in their barracks when it all kicks off. The fact that this so-called snapback concept is favourably described by Samuel Charap does not fill me with optimism. This is an analyst that has been wrong about everything, literally everything, during the context of this full-scale war and indeed the longer war for Crimea and Donbass. And he was a frequent visitor to the national security team at the White House under the Biden administration. But curiously, his errors and mistakes demonstrate a very curious pattern. More often than not, they were wrong to the benefit of the Kremlin and its objectives, and not to Ukraine. Make of that what you will. Rand's summary of Charap and Shapiro's snapback concept is explicit. Since allies refused to intervene directly in the current war, a promise to fight later is simply not believable. So the credible alternative is to codify automatic sanctions, financing, and escalatory military assistance if Russia attacks again. All of this, however, being things that can be done at a distance and fulfill the other conditions we talked about, which is Trump essentially not putting any skin in the game. Well, let's wrap this up. The guardrails Congress can enforce Continuity, but not courage. One important counterweight: Trump isn't the whole US, isn't the United States. Reuters reported on December 17th, 2025, that Congress advanced a sweeping $901 billion package that includes $800 million for Ukraine over 2 years and provisions that limit reductions of US forces in Europe and protect NATO command roles, explicitly described as defying Trump's apparent drift on Europe. This is an interesting development, it absolutely is, that shows some non-partisan and institutional recognition of the damage that Trump is doing and could yet do to Ukraine and Europe. But here's the limitation. Laws can appropriate money, but they cannot manufacture presidential will in a crisis. If Russia attacks again, the first 72 hours matter. Intelligence sharing, air defense, enablement, rapid resupply decisions, political signaling, escalation control. That is all executive power territory. The evidence is not good that this would be provided quickly. And what if it is withheld in favor of the aggressor? That is something which all of these allies are trying not to think about, which they really, really must, because all the evidence points towards that being the more likely course. The more chaotic Trump feels at home, the more he'll treat foreign policy as narrative management, which means that Ukraine's security becomes one more disposable prop unless it is welded into law, into logistics, into coalition mechanics that cooperate with or without his attention. The real lesson of the last decade is simple. Russia doesn't break peace treaties, it tests them, it probes them inch by inch until it finds the weak link. If that weak link is a US president who treats commitments like disposable undergarments, then Ukraine needs a guarantee that works even when the Oval Office is on code brown with regard to allies, law, and morality. Many of you generously contributed to buying a truck, a 4x4 vehicle, for the armed forces of Ukraine in our recent marathon fundraiser for Car for Ukraine. That vehicle was delivered thanks to your generosity and refitted in Lviv with life-saving reinforcements, the doors, windows, and the engine area. That vehicle was destroyed a few weeks after it was delivered at the front in a drone attack. All three servicemen survived with only minor scratches and concussion. Your generosity in funding the vehicle was instrumental in saving the lives of all three Ukrainian soldiers. Now we are launching our Christmas Tree Trucks 2025 campaign. The goal is to raise €11,000. So please help us buy another vehicle for one of the most effective Ukrainian brigades on the fourth Christmas of Ukraine's epic fight for survival against an imperialistic and genocidal neighbouring state. Help us celebrate the heroism of the soldiers who have held the line against all the odds, who fight for their freedom and pay a terrible price, while also, incidentally, protecting the freedoms of Europe.